Good morning. We are back. Welcome back after Shavuos Matan Torah. And we continue studying Hemshech Ayin Beis. What we're doing now is after a long study of the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and the Mittler Rebbe's elaboration on the Maimer Mika Hashem Elokeinu Magbil L'Sheves Amashpili Lires B'Shamayim Ba'aretz. We are going back to Ayin Beis based on those texts and drawing context as well as understanding the flow and the continuation of the ideas, questions and ideas that the Rebbe Rashab raised, but not completely concluded, because he did not finish the Hemshech. So that's what we've been doing the last few classes. So let me sum up what we've covered so far and then continue from there. So what we've learned so far in this context is the general theme of Ayin Beis is interface between the divine and existence. So Hashem Echad is a unity. Now going into the details of how levels of unity, which we're in the middle of learning, Yichud Tata, Yichud Elah, the Yichud of both of them. But overall, a unity between that there's only one reality, and that reality is godliness. And it's our mission is to reveal that unity in this world by making a dira b'tachtein. In that interface itself, there are two general approaches. One is mamata l'mayla, to do it from the bottom up. We study, we live, and we experience the universe, our existence, and from there we extrapolate, we derive, and we arrive to understanding the divine. From the art, we get to the artist. And the other approach is from the Malmayla Lamata, which is from understanding what God gives us a picture of how he sees it all. So it's from the artist to the art, so to speak. The first one is primarily Tefillah, the Avodah of Tefillah, which is Mamata Lamayla, Sulam Mutzavarcha, like a ladder that stands on the ground and reaches upward. And Torah is primarily, the second approach is Torah, which is a revelation from above, like we just come from Matan Torah. Who gave us the Torah? That came from Shamayim, from heaven, from God. So God is giving us his blueprint, a CAT scan, if you wish, a snapshot of his look at existence and the blueprint with which he created existence, and all that Torah represents. In truth, we need both. This is not mutually exclusive nor competitive. They complement each other, the Mamata, Mailamata, as I discussed at length earlier in Ayin Beis, and we reviewed that. That was point number one. Point number two is getting closer to where we are now, and where we are in volume 3, specifically page 1349, 1350, begins the Mamata Lamata after over 550 pages that was dedicated, a long parentheses as well, dedicated primarily to Mamata Lamayla. Again, they overlap, and there's plenty in each one, but general structure is on the top of page 1350. You started talking Ma'atet Tzarech Love and Inyan HaTeirah Shebechinas Hamshachah Mamayla Lamat. And we reviewed the main flow of the ideas in Ayin Beis. I'm reading selected sections. Again, this is being informed by the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So I'm going to continue from where we left, but let me just sum up what we've learned. So on page 1350, we also went over some of the points that the Rebbe Rashab referred to that ultimately we don't find him concluding. Namely, how Torah looks at existence, that the Ohr makes it seer in the Keli as opposed to the Keli making it seer in the Ohr. I should have mentioned that. That's something we reviewed, 3 different places that he refers to it. On page 1348 and 1349, and earlier, I believe, on page 13, no, not 13, sorry, 1286. Yeah, it's sealed in the air. Okay, so now, in explaining Torah, he asked 2 questions. One is, he introduces ner mitzvah v'Torah Ohr. What's the difference between ner mitzvah and ner neshama? Both, we use the example of the candle. What's my tzarich lahavin mao ner neshama, ner the mitzvah. Gam tzarich lahavin, that we find mada adam, the likeness of man, is God created the human being in the divine image. And namely, the neshama is compared to the divine image. The chelik elikam emal mamish. And the same thing we find by Torah. Mada Adam, we also find that Torah is also a b'tzir of Adam. So even though Ohr Ein Sof is higher than any structure that we can define, any defined structure, yet there's also how it manifests. So you ask the question, what is the difference between Mada Adam of Torah and Mada Adam of Neshamas? And this, we don't find any answer to this in Ayin Beis, but it's going to be vital in understanding the whole difference between Mamay Lamata, Mamat Lama, and the difference between Neshamas and Torah. So to begin explaining all of this, he said, now Torah, he started to explain what is Ner Neshama and Ner Mitzvah. So we summed up that as well. Ner Neshama, the three aspects of a candle: the wick, the divine soul, as it's immersed in the oil, the intelligence of the human intelligence of the animal soul, with the goal of turning that oil into fuel that will be absorbed by the wick into the wick and create the eish, the fire, the fiery love of V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. That also the Yetzer Hara, also the Nefesh Habamis becomes a fuel for this Ava, even though initially it is the opposite. It's counter. It has its own agenda and is diametric opposite of the divine soul. But the goal is to transform. Same thing. Ner Mitzvah is also those three components. Here is the Ratzon Elyon. The Ratzon Elyon is the Psili HaMitzvah, Ratzon Elyon HaMislabes B'dvarim Gashmim. It manifests in physical objects. So in the case of Neshama, the oil is the animal soul, the intelligence of the animal soul. In the Mitzvah, the oil is the physical objects of this universe, like wool for tzitzis or klaf, parchment for tefillin, right? And then when we do a mitzvah, what we're doing is, like you said, the melubash be'nasa be'mamish keguf l'neshama. We take the physical options, it becomes like a guf to the neshama of the Ratzon Elyon, and as such, the human being becomes transformed. His physical body and physical being and everything in this physical world becomes a keli, like a merkava, to godliness. Similar to the idea in a microcosm of the neshama. The neshama, it's referring to the animal soul specifically. Here, it's referring to all the objects of the world, turning them into fuel for the divine. Yimin mekareves is embracing u'shagili mamash is a mekarev kol advarim gashmim shem tachas memshel sklipas nega han nechlol ma'adei mitzvahs be'elikus. A second thing a mitzvah has, v'gam yesh ba mitzvah, the zgula, he says, protis lahalas es hanafesh habamis. And we learned in Torah Ohr, and the Mittler Rebbe elaborates, that has a specific power to elevate the animal soul. The kasher be'Ohr Ein Sof Baruch Hu, to bind it to Ohr Ein Sof Baruch Hu. As he explained in Torah Ohr and the Mittler Rebbe, and just to sum up briefly what he said there was that, let me see, do I have the Torah Ohr here? Well, from memory, I'll say it from memory, that basically it's about that the mitzvah, it gives additional power to the soul to impact the animal soul, and that's what Hashem gave us, that the mitzvah has a particular power to affect the physical animal soul, the animal soul that manifests in the physical world, and to elevate it to the divine. Like he explained there about tefillah as well, how the difference between tefillah and Torah, he speaks about that as well in Torah Ohr. I don't want to go into that too much detail because I'll get to that when I get back to Mamay Lamata, Mamay Lamata. Mamat Lamayla, Mamay Lamata. But if you remember, he said a mitzvah is a levush, a makif. And when you, like he gave the example of a slingshot, that when you want to shoot something to a high level, you need to have a force that is like, and he compares that to a mitzvah, that a mitzvah propels the physical world into the divine. And that's what the power of a mitzvah, the makifim, that's what he spoke about. While we begin before davening, we're putting on the talis and tefillin. That all is about the power to elevate the physical world to the elokus. Okay. And that's where we stopped in the review. Now, one more piece now, which I'm going to review now. So what I'm doing is going through Ayin Beis, the second half of volume 3, or the last, we'll call it our last 170 pages of volume 3, from 1350 till it concludes on 1477. I'm sorry, what is that? 120 pages, I should say, right? Shinun Beis, yeah, Tov Ayin Zayin, 120 pages. 127 pages to be exact. So we're going to go over it, select sections just to see the context, and then of course insert in each section what we've learned from the Mittler Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and as well as come to the ultimate place is to continue what we learned from those Maimorim that could help us understand the continuation of Ayin Beis. Right now, let's go over these pieces, and the Mittler Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe's Maimer will definitely help us, because this is based on it, as the Rebbe Rashab says explicitly on the top of page 1350, on the end of the paragraph of first paragraph on page 1352. But Commercial Kosev calls Zeh be'erech b'tereh b'dibra maschil mik Hashem Elokeinu Amagbi. Okay. So now in the fourth line on page 1352, here's what the Rebbe Rashab says. This is mitzvahs. But we still have to address Ner mitzvah, then comes the second half of the pasuk, Torah Ohr. So what's Torah Ohr? So he says here briefly, I'm going to read inside on the fourth line, page 1352. You want to follow? You don't have the sefer, you can look at ayinbeis.com, all the pages there. PDFs of the pages are scanned, and you can follow along there. So he says like this: so by mitzvah we say very precisely the word ner. Ner is a candle. And if you remember, the Mittler Rebbe asked the question, that seems to suggest that the mitzvah is not really light without Torah, and explained why. When we say Torah, you say Torah Ohr. Now this is critical, because remember, Torah is Amshachim Amayl Lamata. So definitely it's a level of Ohr. That's what Ohr is. The whole idea of Ohr is an Ohr from the Moyer, that the source, the luminary, shines, expresses itself, extends itself through Ohr. Like you say, the sunlight. What is sunlight? Sunlight is essentially carrying the light of the sun to the earth, or to wherever it shines. So when you say Torah Ohr, he's saying that this is Ohr, he calls it Ohr Atzmi. And you may recall, I've emphasized this several times when we learned the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe doesn't use the word Ohr Atzmi, he uses Atzmus Ohr. Not that it's necessarily a different level. It's just the language. The Rebbe Rashab is more Ohr Atzmi, is the Rebbe Rashab's type of language. So it's the same content, Ohr Atzmi. Now, Ohr Atzmi, if you recall, was the key point in Torah Ohr, is that the Ohr remains untouched. When you talk about lower levels of Ohr that shine in the darkness, including Ner, there it goes through the Tzimtzum, is diminished by and concealed by the Tzimtzum. Ohr Atzmi, b'chinas Atzmus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. You're getting a direct a reflection, a light that is reflecting the Etzem from Atzmus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. Commercial Kosev Megala Amukis Min Cheshech, that reveals the depths from within the darkness. And this is the pasuk brought in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, discussed at length as well. That's the Torah, amok amok. So in other words, compared to a mitzvah is a ner. A ner is a limited candle, which is much more defined by and relates to existence. So a mitzvah goes into, let's say, tzemer, the wool that is used for tzitzis. That's a very specific. So the mitzvah is Ratzna Elyon, but you don't call it Ohr. And the Mittler Rebbe explained at length why. Because the mitzvah is already mislabish in Gashmis. Remember, I said that mitzvah is like a combination of mamata l'mayla, mamata l'mata. So true, it's a mitzvah given from above, but a mitzvah is not an illuminator. A mitzvah is action-based. A mitzvah doesn't reveal anything. The Torah reveals and tells us what Hashem's mitzvahs are, and reveals God's plan and God's ratzon and God's wisdom. A mitzvah is action-based. The mitzvah is meant to, this is how you perform and you transform this world into a dira b'tachtenim. That's a mitzvah. Torah Ohr is giving us a picture, an image, a picture, a snapshot, a bird's eye view, if you wish, of how God sees all of it, including mitzvahs that come from Torah, which we'll talk about shortly as well. So Torah is amuk amuk. No, the Megala Amukis, it's all about a depth. It's revealing the deepest depths of the divine Ohr Ein Sof. That's what it's referring to. It's the inner and core of Ohr. Again, language very similar to the Mittler Rebbe's language, if not exactly the same words. That's even higher than Gili. In other words, there's the level of Ohr as it comes is revealed. There's the level of Ohr as it's reflecting the Etzem. If you remember, we learned that there's the Ohr Legalis Etzem. It's there just to reveal the source, God. And there's the Ohr Legala Ela Elemis, the Galis Ela Elemis, the Ohr that is tailored toward existence. So here talking about Etzem Shalamayim Chin Sagili, Ukomishon is Boil Il, the Chochma Atzmi. So Torah and Chochma are synonymous. The Chochma of Torah, it's Atzmi. Ubon Nimshach B'Bchinas Atzmus the Ein Sof. And the Chochma resides, or Nimshach is transmits, the core of Ein Sof manifests within Chochma. Okay, so here we have, briefly, not at length. Remember, at length is in the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, especially the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. And the Rebbe Rashab is just saying briefly. So we have a good, we can call it a good placeholder here, because he's explaining, he's talking about it, but he never gets back to this. This is another key point that we need those Maimorim, the Mittler Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, to understand what this Torah Ohr is. But he will not get back to it because the Hemshech of Ayin Beis concludes by the Yichud of the two Yechudim, still talking about Ner Hashem Yishmasadim. He never gets back to Ner Mitzvah either. So both Ner Mitzvah and Torah Ohr, he gets back to briefly, to some extent, a little later we'll talk about it when we get there. But the real continuation, you only find it in the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. But now that we learned that, we can go back here and understand where this would go. So the Rebbe Rashab is bringing here. So now comes the next piece. The next piece is based on the Torah Ohr, and again elaborated on the Mittler Rebbe, and he says like this. So after explaining Torah Ohr, so Torah Ohr is Hamshachim Amayl Lamata Ohr, and we'll keep that in mind because we're going to discuss it a lot more later. He says now, how does it work with the Torah Ohr and Ner Mitzvah? Ner Mitzvah, we just said, is made up of three components: a wick, oil, physical objects, including the animal soul, and then its elevation, which is the light that it creates. So how does it work with Torah Ohr? So it says, Ve'era Torah nechaz ba'psila. This light of Torah, which is the light that's produced by the candle, is nechaz ba'psila. It's contained by the wick. So in other words, what he's saying here is that Torah Ohr is connected to Ner Mitzvah, and this we also learned in the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. If you may recall, there were two ways you could understand it. Either Ner Mitzvah is not Ohr until you have Torah Ohr, or Ner Mitzvah is a Ohr, but a limited Ohr, like a candle gives off some light. And the real powerful light, the Ohr Atzmi, is Torah. These two ways were explained by the Mittler Rebbe, and we quoted, I also cited the Tzemach Tzedek, who emphasizes these two different approaches. So now he says like this: the Ohr of Torah is nechaz ba'psila. So in practicality, how do we access and how do we manifest this light of Torah? It's through the psila, the wick, sheheina mitzvahs. As we learned before, the mitzvah is the wick because it's the ner mitzvah. Ki kol ha-Torah shalifneinu. This is an exact quote from the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, because the entire Torah that we have before us, even though it's true, it's Torah Ohr, and it's reflecting the Ohr Atzmi of Atzmus Ein Sof, nevertheless, how it manifests, Hein Torah shebiksav v'Torah sheba'al peh, both the written and the oral Torah, Ikram v'Yiseidan hu b'mitzvahs. The primary and the foundational element of Torah is primarily about mitzvahs. So even though the Torah has narrative and talks about different events that happen, biblical events from the beginning of creation and throughout, but it's real, the core of Torah is to give us the mitzvahs. So you see from this that even though Torah Ohr on its own is really beyond the mitzvahs. It doesn't say this explicitly here, but I'm explaining. But it manifests through mitzvahs. As I said, this is a direct quote from the Alter Rebbe's Maimon. This is the line that the Rebbe Rashab adds to the Alter Rebbe Mitzvah Rebbe's Maimon. It's a key line. He's explaining that the mitzvahs are actually adjoined, mechaber, they connect the Ohr of Torah with a person and with the world. Remember, we said mitzvahs both elevates the animal soul and elevates the world. So, in other words, if you only had Torah Ohr, you didn't have Ner Mitzvah. You only had Torah Ohr. You'd have a tremendous revelation, and even beyond revelation, like he said, Ohr Atzmi, higher than Gili, God giving us a picture, so to speak, of how He sees everything. Not only existence, how He sees everything. Whatever God reveals in the Torah. But how would it ultimately interface? I'm using that word very deliberately. How would it ultimately connect to the human being in the world? It would be like a picture from above. Hashem gives the Torah. He's telling us what He's on His mind, so to speak, His vision. But without mitzvahs, there's no way of channeling it into turning. Excuse me. There's no way of channeling it and turning. What do you do with the world and with the human being? So now that the Torah translates itself and says, now I will take, Hashem says, here's my Torah. This Torah is Ikram v'Yeseidan mitzvahs. I'm telling you my Ratzon Elyon through this Torah. What is my Ratzon Elyon? All the Tayyag mitzvahs, the 613 mitzvahs. So mitzvahs become a chibur, a mechaber, between Torah Ohr, the Ohr Atzmi, with existence, with the human being and with the world. And he explains it very specifically. And this is, again, v'hu, what does that mean? Sha'nefesh habamis, the animal soul. V'chol hadvarim hanechlolim be'ohr haTorah, which means that the nefesh habamis and all the things, meaning all the physical matters, like tzemer, wool, parchment, animal hide, for that matter, every physical object, nechlolim be'ohr haTorah, are encompassed in the Ohr haTorah. So mitzvahs is essentially the actionable way that we draw down and we implement and we manifest Torah Ohr in this world. So in other words, again, without mitzvahs, the Torah Ohr would be a light, and when we study Torah, it would definitely be revealing light, but it would not have a way to. It wouldn't have a wick. Let's think of it that way. Without a wick, what is light? So it would be a Torah. I know it wouldn't work physically because how do you have light without a candle? But think of it conceptually, it would be a light of the divine without any manifestation, without anything to hold on to. It is the wick of mitzvahs that manifests within the shemen, meaning the shemen of both the animal soul and the physical matter of this existence, that allows us to create Torah Ohr, the light. So based on this, it seems like he's talking about the Ohr is talking not necessarily the Ohr of mitzvah, it's the Ohr of Torah, but it's through mitzvahs that created the wick and the oil will produce this light. So the difference would be neshama produces the avos Hashem. There, the light is the fiery passion of a haftas Hashem lekecha, v'chol avavcha. Here, it's taking all of the nefesh habamis and the physical matters, and it's nichlolim be'er haTorah v'hainu. And this means sha'seichel hativi, that the natural human intelligence of the animal soul mishapach mamish mehafuch el hafuch or mehipuch el hipuch. It's transformed from one extreme to the other. Instead of it being self-oriented, meaning an intelligence which is the animal soul's intelligence on its own, like he explains in Torah and the Mitzvah Rebbe's Maimer, in both Maimorim. Instead of it being absorbed with being consumed with its own needs and self-interest, so it's being transformed to the opposite. The seichel anushi hamusig, the seichel anushi hamusig, from the seichel anushi, human intelligence that's comprehended by the human being, is being transformed to the seichel of the wisdom of Torah, chochmas elikis, the wisdom, the divine wisdom, which is not just wisdom, but also reaches levels beyond wisdom. Again, from the Maimorim that I'm quoting, the Alter Rebbe Mittler Rebbe's Maimor. In a wisdom that is an unknowable wisdom. So, though a mitzvah itself is the performance of what Torah wants, but remember, learning Torah, we learn about the intelligence behind the mitzvah, the logic of the mitzvah, the laws of the mitzvah. So you're learning about God's wisdom. And essentially, it is through the mitzvahs that mechaber the human being with the elam, because the Torah is telling us telling the human being and the world what we should be doing to align existence and make a dira b'tachtenim a home for the divine. The mitzvahs is the way we implement it, and the result is Torah. What we're doing is revealing Torah in this world. So when you take a piece of wool and you turn it into tzitzis, you're actually transforming the physical world into Torah through the mitzvah. And the same thing with in general nefesh habamis, that when you follow Torah and follow its guidelines, so the animal soul does not follow its own whims and interests. It's following what Torah says. The Torah says nefesh habamis. You make money, give tzedakah. You eat a meal, make sure it's l'shem shamayim. It's kosher, make a bracha. And in general, the whole nefesh habamis is being aligned, especially also when you learn Torah. So there's also a mitzvah. You're aligning the wisdom, the mind of the animal soul as well, to align to the God's mind. But it's not just through learning Torah, it's through bichlal, following and living our lives according to the guidelines of Torah, so we're transforming ourselves and the world around us to be aligned with God's plan, God's wisdom, and God's design. And that wisdom is not just a wisdom like human wisdom, it has an element of something that is beyond wisdom, the divine reality, that's chakim b'lei b'chachmi yediyah, which he emphasized, Torah Ohr, remember, is not just wisdom, it's Ohr Atzmi. It's a wisdom that reflects the levels of the divine that are even higher than pure rational intelligence, these higher levels. And then he says, as it's written about, as it's discussed at all this at length, holds that. So clearly it's a very all-encompassing statement. That line is the Maimor we've been learning the last few months. The Maimor from the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's explanation. I already explained why doesn't he mention the Mittler Rebbe. That's quite common. He would say the Maimor of the Alter Rebbe and relying that includes the biurim and explanations of that Maimor, including the Mittler Rebbe's Maimor that we learned. And I know clearly that he quotes the Mittler Rebbe's Maimor later, so it's very clear he's not just quoting Torah Ohr, he's quoting both. And this is a summary of what we've learned, and we see now what we've learned is going to help us understand where the rest of Hemshech Ayin Beis is going to continue from here. Let me stop here. It's a good place to stop for any questions or anything you want to clarify. And then I will continue summing up the continuation, the structure, and the framework of the continuing flow of Ayin Beis. Okay. Any comments, any questions?
Where were you just reading from? The very last psukim?
I was reading from the text on page 1352, top of the page.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Are there no questions? No, everything's clear? Okay. Now, in classic Rebbe Rashab style, he could have hypothetically gone from here and just continue the explanation in Torah Ohr and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimor, the Mika Hashem Elokeinu Maimor, and explain in detail what means Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam and Ner Mitzvah and Torah Ohr. But he doesn't do that. Begins a long discussion, and he says, it starts the next paragraph, and nidali levayed, which is interesting. That's not a very common expression. Nidali levayed means it appears to me, nidali. It seems to me to explain this. Here's how I would explain this. So sometimes the Rebbe Rashab will say yesh leimer, one can say, or I'll just orbir inyan, or I'll explain it. You say nidali levayir. Now, what I derive from that is something I pointed out a few classes back, that the Maimer and Torah Ohr and the Alta and the Mittler Rebbe's explanation is a very complex Maimer on its own. When you learn the Maimer, you don't fully appreciate it until you really learn Ayin Beis. You appreciate it, but to a limited extent. Obviously, the Mittler Rebbe adds a lot through his explanations. So when the Rebbe Rashab says Nidali Levayir, it means he feels it needs explanation. Not just he's going to explain it. He feels that it needs an additional element, and he's bringing, so to speak, his own interpretation of it. This doesn't weaken at all. We say Nidali doesn't mean it's not authoritative, God forbid. Obviously, it's the Rebbe Rashab. But it's interesting that he used that expression. I think it'll become clear when we understand what he's going to do here. So what is the Rebbe Rashab really doing here that we don't find in those Maimorim, in the Mika Hashem Elokeinu Maimer that he just referred to? So it's clearly he's coming to explain all the ideas that he began with, including, like we said, Torah Ohr, that Torah is the Torah of light, and Torah is Hamshachim Amayla Lamata, the Ohr Atzmi. So he's going to go now in a long explanation, and he does not get back to the Maimer Mika Hashem Elokeinu until, look how long this is going to be. It's going to be all the way till page 1463. So we're talking now 1352 till 1463, 111 pages. 111 pages that the Rebbe Rashab is using to explain this whole idea. And then he goes back to Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom and Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Ohr, and he never concludes Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Ohr. He just explains Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, and even that, he doesn't even get back to how it transforms the animal soul to love God. He only speaks about the unification, which as we'll review there. So essentially, if you wanted to look at the whole context here, he started with saying Torah is Torah Ohr. Good. He asked the questions about Ner Mitzvah and Ner Neshama. What is the difference? There is Timara Adam, the likeness of man in Neshamis and likeness of man in Torah. Explain to some extent the summary of the Torah Ohr and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. What is Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, and what is Ner Mitzvah, and what is Torah Ohr? And then 111 pages he uses to start to explain all this before he actually gets back to the subject. And then from 1463 till 1479, we're talking about 16 pages, right? 63 to 79, yeah. Is 73, 16 pages, and then he never concludes the Hemshech of Ayin Beis. So interestingly, he began this whole long explanation, and then does not end I'm sorry, 1477, not 1479, 1477. So it's actually 14 pages, 1463 to 1477. Yeah, 14 pages. So 14 pages is where he gets back to the Maimorim of the Mika Hashem Elokeinu, and most of it does not conclude it. However, by learning what we learned from those Maimorim in Torah Ohr and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and now learning these 111 pages that I just pointed out, we will be able to piece together this puzzle. So let's sum up now what exactly he says in these 111 pages. I'm not going to read, obviously, through all of it, just give you the highlights. So the first main highlight, the most important thing of all, is the first line on page 1352. He says like this: So he brings in another mimer now. This is a mimer actually that was never printed. I pointed it out when we learned it initially. It's a mimer called Ve'einenu Me'ires Kishemesh U'Kiyareach. That L'Osilove, our eyes will shine like the light of the sun and the moon. So he says, what is it? What discussed the Inyan Ohr Hariyah? So to understand what we just learned about Torah Ohr, and of course also Ner Mitzvah, Ner Shem Nishmas Adam, we need to understand what it says elsewhere about Ohr Hariyah. So the Rebbe Rashab feels the need to understand that. You need to understand what is light, the light of vision, basically eyesight. And that becomes now the main theme that he's going to address, Ohr Hariyah. To understand Ohr Hariyah, he's going to bring two other forms of light, moonlight and the luminous stone, three levels of Ohr Makabel, as he calls it. I'll explain shortly what that means, more detail. But you see, the main thing is being an Ohr Hariyah. So the Ohr Hariyah is going to be a critical piece. What's the main punchline with Ohr Hariyah? And I'm summing up basically the whole discussion that goes all the way to the bottom of page 1462. And then we'll break it down in more detail as I go along. Okay. So Riyah, he says, is going to say, has two aspects to it. One is the way the eyesight manifests in our physical being. So there's the power of vision in the soul, but like every koyach hanefesh, the power in the soul is in a way unlimited. But then when it manifests in the body, it manifests in a limited way. And what's the limited way? That the eye can only see that far once it's manifest in the physical eye and cannot see in the dark. That's koyach hariyah, as it's mislabish. We say the koyach, like the Ohr bekeli. The koyach mislabish in the keli, in the called the eye, the physical eye. What about the koyach hariyah in the nefesh? Koyach hariyah in the nefesh does not have this limitation. So hypothetically, if the power of vision in the soul would shine without the limitation of a keli, it would not need. It could see from one end of the world to the other, and it would not need an external light to illuminate it to be able to see in the dark. He says this later in the continuation of this discussion. How is it relevant to us? Because he's going to explain that this koyach hariyah, which is a form of Ohr, that on one hand the eye sees. It's not like the eye doesn't. The eye itself sees. However, it needs an outside light to shine for it to be able to activate its ability to see. Because in the dark, the eye does not have enough light of its own, not a flashlight. There's no rays of light coming out of the eye that illuminate the dark room or the darkness. So it needs a siyua, what he calls. What is the siyua? The siyua is Torah Ohr. In other words, in this world, the neshama, using the nimshal now, the neshama cannot see on its own. We don't know on our own, as much as the neshama is a divine entity, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, but the neshama comes down in this world and it's concealed inside the body. We don't instinctively know what the mitzvah is. We don't instinctively know what halacha is. So we need a Torah to illuminate. The Torah serves as the light that tells us what God wants us to do, tells us the Ratzon Elyon, that is through the mitzvahs that God wants us to perform. And now the neshama knows, following that guiding light, the neshama knows what to do. So the neshama below is like the riyah that's mislabish in the eye, like the neshama mislabish beguf. The neshama on its own, just like the koyach hariyah and the nefesh, does not have this limitation. But on earth, we don't have that access. Ultimately, through our hard work and through our refinement, the neshama will come to a place that it can see without any outside light. Like we learned, the neshama what's higher, Torah or neshama? So he's answered. The neshama below, the Torah is higher, because the Torah is illuminating the neshama. Above, the neshama is higher than Torah. It's rooted higher than Torah. But to access that level, you first have to go through the lower level, meaning allowing the Ohr of Torah Ohr, to illuminate for us, and then to illuminate the direction for the neshama to live its life. As the neshama follows that, the neshama becomes more and more acclimated to what the divine is. That's why the Asad Lave, we will not need the Torah to tell us what to do. The neshama will instinctively know that's einenu me'iris keshemesh yireach, that our eyes will see like the sun and the moon. It will be illuminated like the sun. The sun does not need an outside light. The sun gives off light. So basically, these two levels of Riyah is what is the Rebbe Rashab is using to explain the context of Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom and Torah Ohr and Ner Mitzvah. Again, the Rebbe Rashab never gets back to it. He never comes and ties it all together. But based on what we've learned, and based on now what we've learned in the Mikra Hashem Elokeinu Maimer, in the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, we can, I said, piece together and develop this whole picture where he's going to with all of this. So that's essentially a summation of the next 111 pages that the Rebbe Rashab is using to explain this idea of what Torah ultimately is in context of the neshama, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom. But from this, we'll be able to also answer the questions of what's the difference between Mara Adam in the neshama and Mara Adam of the Torah. Again, though the Rebbe Rashab doesn't explicitly say it, but it becomes pretty obvious. Because Torah's Mara Adam is giving us a likeness of the divine within human in an illuminated way. Mara Adam of the neshama is manifest in a concealed way and needs Torah to illuminate it. But then the Mara Adam of the neshama elevates to a place that's even higher than Torah. And it actually can be mashpia into Torah, as we shall learn as well. That's some of a short summary. Now, another benefit we have is after page 1462, on 1463, when he goes back to the topic of Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, the Rebbe Rashab gives us a good few pages, around 4 pages, where he brings back the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, Mikra Hashem Elokeinu, and then he goes off into explaining the details of how we actually transform the animal soul. But we'll get to that when I get there. Right now, I want to do is sum up, as I said, what we are learning till that point. But it's still all necessary for the context to understand the continuation, where he goes back to, like in Ma'at Tzarech Lahavin, Mashakasim Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom and Ner Mitzvah on page 1463. That comes after these 111 pages that I'm began summing up right now. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do next, obviously, is go through these 111 pages, but before I do, let me stop here in case anybody wants me to clarify anything in this overview.
I had a question, Rabbi. In other words, like it says in the world, when in the world to come, or whatever, however you want to put it, I get confused about that a little bit, but that everything will radiate the light of Hashem, right? The energy. So including people, right? So we'll be radiating, that part of our neshama that's going to be revealed, will also be radiating it, not just like the objects in the world that you'll be able to see the godly energy. So we will be like walking godly energy, right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to elaborate a lot more about that. I don't want to do it right now because that should come as an explanation in what we're going to review. But ultimately, I speculate that the Rebbe Rashab would have come back to that, because there are hints to it earlier. If you recall, when we spoke about neshama nizunis min aguf, the idea that neshama itself will be sustained by the body, and other references of what will be lasted lave. So it seems to me, based on what we've learned a lot earlier, and I'll refer to it later, that the Rebbe Rashab would return after he finishes explaining how the Torah illuminates the neshama and illuminates the human being and the world. How then the neshama la'asad lave, once the world is refined and the human being is refined, that we ourselves will be giving off this light. There's also more to say about the mimer itself of the Einenu Me'ires, is a mimer of the Mittler Rebbe that was not printed, as I said. It's based on a mimer of the Alter Rebbe. It's a fascinating mimer, which also is a little cryptic when you read it on its own, but I think with the Rebbe Rashab you can understand. he actually talks about 3 levels there. I just mentioned 2. One is the Riyah as it's limited right now, where we need an outside light. Then there's the Einenu Me'iris, where the eyes themselves will see like the sun, meaning the eyes themselves will give off light. And then there's a 3rd level where he talks about that all that is still manifests in the world of Riyah, in sight. Just a question whether it's limited sight and needs an outside light or it has its own light. Then he says there's how the etzem is completely beyond eyes altogether. God doesn't need eyes to see, and that will even have a gili of that etzem. Now that the Rebbe Rashab does not get back to as well. We also don't have any hint, a little hint to it. I have a theory on this, that the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe do hint to it when they speak about, remember the expression, the Riyah, where he calls the Torah, where he says, Hamashpili Lires. Remember the last thing we learned in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and as well as in Torah Ohr, in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, is Lires. That Lires is not Shmiya, is not Shema Yisrael, is to see. And it's so when you look at that Maimer Ve'einenu Me'iris, we'll also get to a 3rd level, which I would probably submit is like the level of Yehuda Tata, Yehuda Elah. So both of them are still a vision. It's just the difference of a vision from a top down or the vision from the bottom up. That's still all in the category of Riyah. And then there's how it is in the Etzem that unites the two Das Elyon and Das Tachten. That may be this 3rd highest level which we reach, which is even higher than the vision of the eye, even when it's unencumbered and does not need an outside light. Now, if you lost me on this, it's fine. I will get into it a lot later, more at length. I just don't want to go there because that's like an additional point that comes after we learn everything we've learned. In other words, what I'm saying is that I think that Ayin Beis very easily could have gone on who knows how many pages, because there are, on my count, there are at least 3, 4, 5, probably 5, 6 ideas that still would have been developed had the Rebbe Rashab continued based on the Maimorim that he's quoting, including the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and now this Ve'einenu Me'iris, which also throws in a whole new dimension to this whole discussion. So, as I said, I will do my best to try to sum it all up and explain it in that context. But the bottom line that I do want to say, just to keep keep our eyes on the ball here and focused, is this. It all comes down to the interface and how they join together. That's very clear. That's the real bigger picture. What we're doing now is trying to understand how we see it through Torah, how Torah contributes. Remember, the neshama has its own powers and it can affect the animal soul. The neshama is also now armed with mitzvos, and it's also armed with Torah Ohr. So when you have all those combination of neshama and davening, and mitzvahs, ner mitzvah, and Torah Ohr, we have the full arsenal of everything we need to transform this world into a dira b'tachtenim, into a home for the divine. That's the key thing to keep in mind. The details are how that works. What is Torah coming to contribute? That is what we're going to be learning now, or what he explains now, starting from page 1352 till, as I said, till 1462. And then on 1463, he'll continue. So it's actually 110 pages. I keep saying 111. Around 110 pages. But it's all relevant and critical. And as I said, we'll do that. I'll continue that in the next classes. We'll piece by piece. And remember, we also learned all of this. But we learned it before we knew, before we reviewed the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, and also before we concluded Ayin Beis, where this is all headed. So a lot of what we're discussing now and will be discussing was discussed, but not the full context of it. Okay, I hope everybody's following, because we're not learning so much. I mean, I'm learning inside just to show we are, but we're not learning the flow of a particular mimer here. We're learning more the whole context of it. So I think I'll stop here. Yeah.
I have one more question concerning the Ayin Beis. As much as I remember, at the beginning, Rabbi Rashab tried to present the whole picture in a more general way. And he was talking about that we as humans don't have receptors, the sensors to see godliness, to see God. And from the very beginning, he didn't concentrate on the rear. He just said, as much as correct me if I mistake, he just said that we as human only have those that only can have some kind of in addition, we don't see the straight godliness. He doesn't say see. He said we don't have receptors. If I'm right, then as a general, he at the beginning didn't concentrate on rear, and maybe as a receptors, he might meant even Shmir and Ria and all other receptors that we have that would be able to get together to as a Ria in a most important way.
That's correct. That is correct. But that's in the beginning, as you said.
Yes.
Once we work on ourselves, like anything, when a person exercises a muscle, the muscle becomes stronger to the point that it could, like, a child can't walk immediately. But as the muscles develop, the child learns to walk. The same thing with our minds. When we're young children, our minds only understand certain things. But as our minds expand and our containers get refined, we become more and more acclimated and able to assimilate. And our receptors, as you put it, and sensors become more sensitive and are able to integrate higher levels of perception. That's what human beings' growth is. When we go from mutva, murgish, muskul, we mature to higher states of consciousness. So through Torah and Mitzvos and the neshama working with them throughout our lifetimes, we refine ourselves and the world to the point that we will be able to be receiving, our receptors will be able to directly experience godliness. Today, for example, you don't need any book or any teacher to be a guiding light to tell you that you're hungry or that you're tired or that you're not feeling, or not you, but that a person's not feeling well. Your body tells you. And when Mashiach comes, after thousands of years of hard work, our souls, our very beings will tell us what God wants. So all our faculties, including our senses, will all be aligned with that divine, but that's through years of hard work. That's exactly what Avodah is, Avodas Hashem. Now, I will add one more thing. Of all the sensors and all the receptors that we have, sight becomes the one that is most dominant. That's why you'll find when Mashiach comes, a lot is talked about that we will see godliness. If you go to Tanya, chapter 36, he brings, I believe, 4 verses that everything there refers to seeing. Even though hearing and smell and taste and touch are all important senses and they're all part of the experience, but sight is ultimately going to be the ultimate. That when so today, for example, we can hear and understand about godliness, but we don't see it with the quite clarity and resonance like we see the physical world. So sight becomes the most dominant receptor in this context that is going to be transformed from first using our eyes to follow the light that the Torah directs us. So it illuminates us to be able to see it through this dark world and the dark roads of this confused world. And then there'll be the stage where we'll be able to see through our own eyes, as we're going to learn. So that's the context.
For me, the C is just a synonym of combination of all our receptors in one, in order to see the full picture as it is. Because we can see the picture, but we cannot comprehend it in our, with, as you said, with our undeveloped mind. Yes. And here, if we
But keep in mind what we learned at the end of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, that Chocham Einav Bereshe, seeing is not just physical seeing, it's also intelligent seeing. An intelligent person sees with their mind. The mind is also an illuminator. You know, two people can look at the same object, and the wise one will see something that the other one doesn't see. So it's all, so it's all part of that higher level of perception. Yeah, that's exactly what he says. He feels that he's going to explain this idea with the power of eyesight, Ohr Hariyah, the light of vision, because vision, at the end of the day, the reason God created us with eyes to see is for us to be able to see Him, to see God. And that's the key thing here is so therefore, when we study the human eyesight, we study the very concept, what do we call it? The study of optometry, I forgot what it's called. But bottom line is, when we study and understand the anatomy of the eye and the very nature of of how we see things, from that we're going to learn these levels of perception, ultimately divine perception. That's exactly right. If you remember, we also mentioned in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer that by Matan Torah they saw the sounds and they heard the sights. So there's also that element of being able to experiencing something that is beyond even just the limited sense as we know it. Okay.
Thank you.
Good. So we'll stop here.
I have a quick question.
The beginning of the paragraph on page 1352 is where I've summed up, and we'll continue the summary. As I said, I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to read select sections, just to keep to understand the whole flow. But go ahead. Yes, you want to ask something?
Yeah, I'm trying to ask if you personally have given more thought to this idea of what I mean. You use very clear words to explain this notion of seeing godliness, but I'm wondering if you've taken it further in a more clinical, practical sense. Do you think this refers to a time, and it says Lasi Lavo in Messianic times, where to see godliness, do you see this as something that's more like an intuition, like when you look at something or a situation or a set of circumstances, either in front of your face or in your mind, you will be able to intuit the godliness of it? Is that a fair? Is intuition playing into this, or is it mamish physical seeing godliness?
You can intuit now. You don't need Lasid Love for that. People intuit God all the time through existence, and not just even to learn Chassidus. Poets do it. Musicians do it. They talk about a leaf. They talk about a sunset, and so you can intuit it today. This is talking physical in the sense of, I mean, to someone that doesn't have it yet, obviously is not going to be able to experience it. So right now, you have to intuit what it may look like to physically see it. But I think of it. I mean, if you want some palatable example, I would say, think of a physicist, or for that matter, a chemist, or a botanist. They look at the same physical object. So I'm not going to say they see the subatomic particles physically, but they definitely have a deep sense of it, more than just intuition. And I could see it in a sense. I mean, if you want X-ray vision type of idea, when you look at an X-ray, suddenly the physical skin or filter or the physical partition, it melts away. You can see the bone structure, or the same thing with different scans. So that even with the physical eye, you can see that. So there are examples where you can relate to and realize that the nature of the world is just an outside shell. Even today, the fact of the matter is, people are very comfortable with the invisible. By using computers and smartphones and everything, we're becoming more and more, invisible things to us are very common today. It's not even a matter of faith. Even though we don't see all the what's it called, all the gears and motion,
moving parts.
When you press, let's say, when you touch your screen, but all of us feel very comfortable that I touch the screen, it sets in motion and triggers all kinds of forces, and if you put it under a microscope, you could technically see the currents, electrical currents or other currents at work. So my point is that once upon a time, what you saw is what you got. We looked at the world. Most of us did not know there's a whole labyrinth, a whole pulsating energy beneath the surface that's dynamic and alive. Today we know there's no such thing as the inanimate. Everything is animated. Just a question of whether you experience it or not. So the idea of through science and other things, you could find examples where you can see, and ultimately, I see no reason if we can see the physical world, why shouldn't we be able to somewhat see the spiritual world if we have our eyes are more spiritualized, so to speak? I would submit this: when any one of us look at someone you love, you see them the same way I see them? Absolutely not. You see their face, and someone will say to you, what do you see that I don't see? It's hard to even quantify. You see everything. I see exactly the same thing. I see their face, I see their eyes, I see their hand. But you'll see their personality automatically. Like you'll say, so are you seeing it or you're not seeing it? I would say you're seeing it. You're just not. It's true. You can't say I see it like you see a picture. It's not like a picture of it, but you become so accustomed to that person that the face is actually just a signpost that they're in the room. But you're really experiencing their presence. I mean, I can go on. There's many ways to explain and try to understand. But the more you are, let's put it this way, the more bittul you have, which means the more you suspend your limited being trapped and enslaved by your perceptions, the more you can see deeper things. That's what it really comes down to.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was really good. Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll stop here. As I said, I'm reviewing Ayin Beis.